The silt pond foreman walked past Jonah Brick's gate that evening for the third time in 8 days, and on the third pass he stopped and looked up the gravel cut toward the cabin and did not move for a count of 14. Jonah counted because counting was what his hands did when his hands were not doing anything else. He was sitting on the porch step with a tin cup of cold coffee and a 6-year-old Belgian Malinois lying across his right boot, and the dog was not asleep. The dog had stopped being asleep on the second pass 4 days back, and now she only put her head down because Jonah had asked her to. Her eyes stayed open. Her ears moved in the small, careful way Lackland trains them to move. She watched the man at the gate the way she had once watched a wadi crossing outside Mosul. Jonah did not need to look at her to know. Earl Kendrick was 61, and he had been with the Pocahontas Coal Resources silt pond operation for 34 years, the last 11 as foreman of the Big Branch Impoundment that sat on the ridge above Coal Run Holler. He had been Massey before Massey sold, and he had been Alpha after Massey, and now he was Pocahontas after Alpha. And the only thing that had changed about the pond in those 34 years, as far as Jonah could tell, was the company logo on Earl's coveralls, and the depth at which Earl was prepared to tell a federal inspector the truth. He stood at Jonah's gate in clean blue coveralls, with the new Pocahontas patch on his left chest pocket, and he watched the cabin and the porch and the dog, and after a count of 14 he turned without raising a hand or speaking a word, and he walked back down the gravel cut toward his pickup. The truck door slammed, the engine started, the truck rolled away. Jonah drank the last of the cold coffee. Hazel kept her head on his boot for another 6 seconds, then lifted it and looked at him. He did not look back. He had learned not to look back at her when she was telling him something. The look broke the signal. She would tell him 3 or 4 times in different ways, and if he kept his eyes on the gate, she would settle. And if he turned to her, she would think the conversation was over, and she would relax. So he held his eyes on the empty gravel where the foreman had stood, and he let her finish what she was telling him. She finished by getting up, walking 3 paces toward the gate, sniffing the air and coming back. She sat down. She put her chin on his knee. That was the closing punctuation. He understood. She had said her piece. The matter was now between the two of them and the gravel cut. It was the last week of June, the year of our Lord 2026, and the holler smelled the way McDowell County hollers smell in late June, which is to say like rhododendron bloom and wet leaf mold, and underneath those, the faintly metallic damp that comes off old coal camp ground that has been weeping iron and sulfur for 100 years and has not yet finished. The cabin sat on a bench above Coal Run, on land Jonah had bought in 2024 from a Massey pension widow who had been trying to sell it for 19 months and had not found a buyer, because the local realtor had explained, with the slow patience of a man who has watched outsiders come and go for 2 generations, that nobody but an idiot put down money in McDowell County in 2024. Jonah had counted out $26,000 in cashier's checks at the widow's kitchen table, signed the deed, and shaken her hand. She had asked him if he understood what was above him on the ridge. He had told her he did. The widow's name was Imogene Maynard, and she had been raised in Coal Run Holler, and her father had worked 38 years for the Pittston Coal Company, and she had told Jonah, sitting at her kitchen table with the deed half signed, that the Big Branch Impoundment was, as far as she had been able to figure across her 73 years of life under it, a slow death sentence that the people of the holler had agreed to in exchange for being allowed to live there. Jonah had asked her why she was selling then, instead of holding the parcel for her children. She had said her children had moved to Charlotte and were not coming back, and that she would rather a man with his eyes open hold the land than a man with his eyes closed. He had asked her if her eyes had been open. She had said, after a pause, "Not soon enough." The cabin was small. 22 feet by 16, single room with a sleeping loft up under the rafters, hand-laid Pocahontas coalfield sandstone foundation that the original homesteader had pulled out of the creek bed in 1894, chestnut log walls that had been replaced twice, once after the 1898 fire, once after the 1947 flood, but were now standing in their third life and were good for another century if the joists held. Jonah had walked the perimeter twice on his first visit, run his hand along the chinking, smelled the coal dust still embedded in the foundation stones, and known that this was the parcel. The cabin was not why. The cabin was a place to sleep. The reason was 12 feet below the cabin, under a flagstone hearth, under a layer of clay and a course of brick that the original homesteader had laid down in 1894 and that no one had touched since. A cellar, or more precisely, a hidden space that had once been a cellar and had been sealed at some point between 1898 and 1947 and had been forgotten by every subsequent owner. Jonah had found it on his third walk of the cabin, on a damp morning in March of 2025, when he had been kneeling on the hearth checking the fit of a stovepipe against the chimney mass and had noticed that the flagstones in front of the hearth rang differently underfoot. He had tapped them with the handle of a screwdriver. One had given back a hollow note. He had levered it up. Below it had been a course of soft red brick, set in clay mortar, and below the brick, when he had pulled 3 of the bricks out with his fingers, had been black air and the smell of cold stone. He had not gone in that day. He had put the brick back. He had sat on the hearth with his hand on Hazel's flank, and he had thought about what kind of homesteader, in 1894, building a one-room cabin on a coal camp parcel above Coal Run Holler in McDowell County, West Virginia, would dig himself a cellar he had not finished, and then seal it under his own hearth. There were several possible answers. The most likely was that the cellar had been finished, had been used through one generation, and had been sealed by a later occupant for reasons of structural concern, or vermin, or shame about what had been buried in it. The second most likely was that the original homesteader had been a Union veteran of the Battle of the Crater in 1864, had come home with a particular understanding of what high explosives could do to layered earth, and had built himself a place to go to ground. The deed Jonah had signed listed the original grantee as one Elias Brick of Wise County, Virginia. The name was Jonah's family name. The county was the county his father's people had come from before the move to Mingo in 1906. Jonah had not, at the kitchen table with Imogene Maynard, mentioned the name match. He had paid the $26,000 and signed the deed and shaken her hand and driven down to Welch and registered the title at the courthouse. And only then, sitting in the truck in the courthouse parking lot with a copy of the deed in his lap, had he opened his phone and pulled up the genealogy file his sister had assembled 3 years before. Elias Brick, born 1842, Wise County, Virginia, enlisted 48th Pennsylvania, 19th Volunteer Regiment, by way of a Wheeling muster station, 1862. The 48th Pennsylvania had been the regiment that had dug the mine under the Confederate works at Petersburg in 1864 and had set off 4 tons of black powder beneath them on the morning of the 30th of July, and had then watched their own assault disintegrate in the crater they had blown. Elias Brick had survived the crater. He had mustered out in 1865. He had moved to McDowell County in 1891, the county then less than 30 years a part of West Virginia, and had homesteaded the parcel on Coal Run in 1894. 3 years before he died of complications from a black lung condition he had picked up in the small drift mine he had worked between the homestead winter and the planting spring. Elias Brick had dug a cellar under his cabin. Of course he had. A man who had been at the crater did not sleep in a cabin without a place to go to ground. The dog was named Hazel, and she had been EDD certified at Lackland in 2017, class 24-09, and she had run 2 CENTCOM rotations as a contract dog with a Marine MSOT before being rolled over to a SEAL element in 2021, where she had worked under a chief named Tomas Ortiz, until Ortiz was wounded outside Erbil in the spring of 2022 and was retired to a kennel disability program in San Antonio. Hazel had stayed in the kennel for 14 months because Ortiz had been her 3rd handler in 5 years, and the program psychologist, a retired Army major named Dr. Ruth Halligan, had flagged her for handler attachment stress that the kennel staff were not equipped to manage. In April of 2024, when Jonah had been 6 months out of the teams and had been sleeping in a 1-bedroom rental in Virginia Beach and had been losing weight in a way his sister had noticed before he had, Dr. Halligan had called him. She had not asked. She had told him. She had said, "I have a dog that I'm not going to euthanize, and I'm running out of options, and you are the only retired chief on my call list whose name 2 of my floor staff brought up unprompted, and I want to know whether you are in a condition to take her or whether I have to keep looking." Jonah had driven from Virginia Beach to San Antonio in 31 hours. He had brought Hazel home in the cab of the truck. She had not slept on the drive. She had not eaten, not slept on the drive. She had not eaten. She had drunk water when he offered it. On the second night, in a motel in Memphis, she had climbed onto the bed and laid her head on his chest and had cried, that small, high keening sound that Malinois make when they are not bred to cry, for 40 minutes without stopping, and then she had slept. Jonah had not slept. He had lain on his back with his hand on her flank, and he had stared at the ceiling, and he had understood, with the slow clarity that comes to men who have been very close to giving up and have not yet given up, that this dog was now the reason he was going to keep waking up in the morning, and that he was now the reason this dog was going to keep waking up in the morning, and that this was sufficient. That had been 2 years and 2 months before the evening Earl Kendrick stood at his gate, counting 14 seconds. The author of this account, I owe you the standard frame, is a retired chief petty officer who served 30 years in the Navy, the last 10 as a BUDS instructor at Coronado, and who spends most of his summers now visiting old teammates in the places they have scattered to. The man I am calling Jonah Brick is one of those teammates, though the name is not the name on his retired ID card, and the cabin is not exactly where I have put it on the map, and certain particulars of the events of late June and early July 2026 have been adjusted to keep his neighbors from being identifiable to the wrong people. The dog is the dog. The cellar is the cellar. The Big Branch impoundment is real, and it is named in the public record under a different name that anyone with a search engine can find. The events I'm about to describe are assembled from the chief's account, from my own walk of the holler in October of 2026, and from the public Mine Safety and Health Administration filings that surfaced under FOIA request between September and December of that year. Where my memory differs from the chief's, I have gone with the chief's. Where the MSHA record differs from the chief's, I have noted the discrepancy. Per team's doctrine, the man on the ground is the source, unless the documents say otherwise. As far as I know, the documents in this case mostly confirm. Hedging language, as my old master chief used to say, is the difference between a sea story and a court-martial. I will use mine where I have to. The chief had come to Coal Run Holler because his wife had died in November of 2022 of a stroke at the kitchen table of their rented house in Virginia Beach at the age of 43. Her name was Lena. She had been a Marine Corps intelligence officer for 9 years and a Defense Intelligence Agency analyst for 6 more, and she had died with a half-buttered piece of toast in her left hand and a copy of The Atlantic open on the table in front of her. And the chief had been in the living room watching a college football game when she had made a small sound he had not at first understood. By the time he had reached the kitchen, she had been on the floor, and her pupils had not been responding the way pupils respond, and by the time the paramedics had reached the house, she had been dead for 9 minutes. The autopsy had given the cause as a ruptured berry aneurysm on the left middle cerebral artery, of a kind that had probably been congenital and had probably been with her since girlhood and had simply, on the afternoon of the 12th of November 2022, decided to be done waiting. He had retired from the team 6 months later. He had sold the Virginia Beach house. He had spent 10 months drinking too much and sleeping too little in a rental he did not own. And then in April of 2024, he had driven to San Antonio for the dog. And in March of 2025, he had driven to McDowell County for the cabin. And in June of 2026, he was sitting on the porch step watching Earl Kendrick walk away from his gate for the 3rd time in 8 days. And he was understanding, with the calm clarity that experienced operators understand operational signals, that something was moving on the ridge above him. There was, the chief had told me, more than one reason a silt pond foreman might walk past a gate 3 times in 8 days. The first reason was concerned neighborliness. The second reason was harassment. The third reason was reconnaissance. A man checking what would be in his way when the time came that he needed something not to be in his way. Earl Kendrick was not a neighborly man. Earl Kendrick was capable of harassment, but had not, in any of the 8 previous months since Jonah had moved permanently into the cabin, employed it. Earl Kendrick had a small handful of grievances against Jonah, all of them documented in his own conversation around the Welch diner counter, a counter at which Jonah did not appear, but which was a place where Jonah had several reliable acquaintances. And none of those grievances were the kind that put a man at another man's gate 3 times in 8 days. That left the third reason. And the third reason interested Jonah because he had been studying since the previous October certain features of the Big Branch impoundment that no one in Coal Run Holler was currently studying. He had been studying them with a $40 Bushnell spotting scope set up on the second-floor sleeping loft, with a notebook in which he wrote the date and time and one or two short phrases that meant something to him and that would mean nothing to anyone else. The notebook now ran to 34 pages. The most recent entry, dated the previous Thursday evening at 7:12, read, "White plume, south face below 10-year mark, 11th time since April, est volume up." White plume meant a small slumping of saturated coal slurry along the south face of the impoundment dam, releasing a thin film of milky water that ran for 6 or 7 feet before being reabsorbed by the dam material. Below 10-year mark meant the plume was occurring below the high water mark that the impoundment had reached at any point in the previous 10 years, which meant the pond was either fuller than its publicly reported level or that the dam's structural retention was failing at depth. 11th time since April meant Jonah had counted 11 plumes since the snowmelt runoff had ended, which was 11 more plumes than had been visible in the same period the year before. Est volume up meant the plumes were getting bigger. Earl Kendrick, foreman of the Big Branch impoundment for the past 11 years, knew about the plumes. Earl Kendrick had to know. The plumes were on his face of the dam. The chief had not, on the evening Earl Kendrick walked away from the gate for the third time, gone up to the loft to write in his notebook. He had stayed on the porch step until full dark, and Hazel had stayed across his boot, and the fireflies had come up out of the rhododendron and had drifted between the porch and the gate in slow yellow arcs. After full dark, he had gone inside and lit the oil lamp on the kitchen table. There was electric service to the cabin, but he had wired the lamp in deliberate parallel because the rural co-op grid had failed twice in his first 8 months, and he did not intend to be caught without light a third time. And he had fed Hazel a 1/4 pound of cooked beef shoulder from a stoneware dish, and he had eaten the rest of it himself with a slice of cornbread and a glass of buttermilk. Then he had walked across the room to the hearth, knelt down and placed his hand flat on the flagstone that rang hollow. The cellar was there. It was finished. He had finished it in the 11 months between the moment he had first found it and the moment Earl Kendrick had walked past his gate for the third time. He had dug it out by hand, alone, in evenings and on Sunday afternoons, hauling the spoil up through the hearth opening in a 5-gallon bucket and dumping it down the cut bank toward the creek. He had laid a new floor of banked clay over a layer of crushed rock for drainage. He had repointed the original 1894 sandstone walls. He had added, and this was the part of the design that no one in McDowell County had any idea he had done, because no one had been inside the cabin during the 11 months except him and Hazel and one weekend visit from his sister and her husband, he had added a second access. The hearth flagstone was the front door. The second door was a vertical hatch, concealed inside the chimney mass itself, 12 feet up, sized exactly to take a grown man on his belly. He had cut it through the chimney wall on the cabin's interior side, and he had hinged it from a piece of 3/8 plate steel that he had hammered flat himself on a small portable forge in the dooryard. And he had hung the steel plate inside a course of removed firebrick that fit back into the chimney face when the hatch was closed. From the cabin interior, the chimney was a chimney. From inside the cellar, with the firebrick removed, there was a vertical shaft up the inside of the chimney mass. Climbable on rebar rungs, Jonah had set into the mortar at 8-inch intervals, opening into a niche behind the stovepipe at the rear of the firebox. From the niche, a man could push aside the iron damper plate and emerge directly into the back of the wood stove, in which there had been no fire for the previous 8 months, because Jonah had been waiting to confirm the function of the upper hatch before he began routine fires. The stove was for cooking, supposedly, and for winter heat. That was what Imogene Maynard had thought it was for when she had sold him the cabin. That was what Earl Kendrick and the rest of Coal Run Holler thought it was for if they thought about it at all. In fact, the stove, by Jonah's hand and over the 11 months of patient evening work, had become a door, a second door into a hidden space that was now, on the night of the 28th of June, 2026, the most carefully thought-out small structure within 30 miles of the ridge under which Earl Kendrick was, at that hour, doing something that Jonah did not yet know about, but had begun to feel. Hazel was lying on the braided rag rug in front of the stove. She lifted her head when Jonah knelt on the hearth. She watched him lift the flagstone, set it carefully to one side, pull out the 3 soft red bricks that closed the lower opening, and lower his legs into the dark of the cellar shaft. She did not whine. She did not get up. She had seen him go down through the hearth more nights than not over the past 11 months, and she had learned what it meant. He was going to check the space, count the stores, make sure the lamp on the cellar shelf still drew, make sure the air at depth was breathable. He would be back in 20 minutes. She put her head down on her paws. She did not close her eyes. The Lackland training, even 6 years out, did not let her close her eyes when her handler was below grade and the door was open. In the cellar, 8 feet by 11 feet, ceiling at 6 feet 4 inches. Jonah was 6 feet 1, and he had given himself 3 inches of headroom and not a fraction more, because the original masonry was Elias bricks, and he had not wanted to disturb it. Packed clay floor over crushed limestone drainage. Walls of 1894 hand-laid sandstone, repointed in 2025 with a hot lime mortar Jonah had mixed himself. Jonah lit the kerosene lamp on the cellar shelf and walked the inventory. Shelf 1, left wall. Drinking water and food-grade 5-gallon plastic carboys, 18 of them, 90 total gallons, rotated quarterly. Shelf 2, left wall. Dry goods and galvanized buckets with screw-down lids, 4 buckets of pinto beans, 2 of rice, 1 of cornmeal, 1 of rolled oats, 1 of dry powdered milk, 1 of granulated sugar, 1 of salt. Shelf 3, left wall, medical, in a hard-shell case from his team's days. Gauze, hemostatic powder, 3 IV starter kits with saline bags, 2 unit doses of TXA, a Crofab antivenom kit good through May of 2027, pediatric epinephrine in 2 strengths, a sterile birthing kit because Lena had once told him that if he ever ran a hideaway, he was going to need one, and he had thought she was joking until the morning she had explained to him she was not. Shelf 4, right wall. Ammunition for the lever-action 30-30 Marlin and the 12-gauge Mossberg and the SIG P229 service pistol he had carried for 26 years, plus 600 rounds of .223 for the AR he kept in the loft of the cabin upstairs and would bring down only if he had a reason. Shelf 5, right wall. Tools, lengths of small diameter rope, a roll of stovepipe sheet, a hand-cranked battery-charging dynamo, a hand-cranked AM/FM shortwave receiver, a small box of trade goods, silver dimes, a pound of green coffee beans, a folded length of canvas tarp. Shelf 6, back wall, low. The bookshelf. Lena's books. The 14 volumes that had stayed with her through every PCS move, from Quantico to Stuttgart and back, and that he had not been able to sell and had not been able to throw away when he had sold the Virginia Beach house. He had not thought when he had started the cellar that the books would go here. They had ended up here because he had not known where else to put them, and because the cellar was the only space in the cabin that was completely his and completely dry. The 14 books were on a shelf that he had built with his own hands out of chestnut planking, salvaged from a collapsed shed at the back of the parcel. There were her 3 Marine Corps publications. There were her 2 volumes of E.M. Forster. There was her annotated copy of Thucydides. There was her hardback Robert Caro on Johnson, all 4 volumes. There were her 3 poetry collections, 1 Bishop, 1 Heaney, 1 Levertov. There was the 1 volume of Norwegian folktales her grandmother had given her for her 10th birthday. He stood in front of the shelf for a count of 10, and he did not touch any of the books. He had not touched the books since the morning he had put them on the shelf 8 months back. He did not know whether he would ever touch them. Their presence was sufficient. Then he turned, walked to the front of the cellar, looked up the shaft he had cut into the chimney, and tested the rebar rungs by climbing them one-handed to the top. The hinged steel plate at the niche behind the firebox opened cleanly. He pushed it. He saw through into the dark interior of the stove. He let it swing closed. He came back down. He checked the lamp. He blew it out. He climbed up the front shaft, set the 3 bricks back in their course, lowered the flagstone, and brushed the hearth clean with the small handbrush he kept on the mantel. Hazel watched all of this without lifting her head, but her ears tracked him through each transition. And when he stood at last in front of the stove and stretched his back, she got up, walked to him, and pressed her head against his thigh. He put his hand on her skull. They stood there for a moment. He had not, in his entire time at Coal Run Holler, told anyone about the cellar. He had not told Imogene Maynard. He had not told the realtor. He had not told his sister, who had visited in October of 2025 and had slept on the cabin's pulled-out daybed without ever knowing that the flagstone under the kitchen table she had eaten her breakfast on was a door. He had not told Dr. Halligan when she had called in February to check on Hazel's adjustment. He had not when he and Hazel had walked the wagon road into Welch for cornmeal and lamp oil and the occasional pound of green coffee, mentioned the cellar to old Wendell Pruitt at the hardware counter, though Wendell was a retired UMW miner who would have understood the design at a glance. He had told no one. The reason he had told no one was, in the chief's later accounting to me, threefold. The first reason was Team's doctrine. You do not advertise a cache. You do not name a hide. The space exists. The space is known to the smallest possible number of people. Every person you add to the list of people who know about the space is a person who can, deliberately or carelessly, end the space. The second reason was Lena. Lena had been a DIA analyst who had worked on Russian targeting through 3 administrations, and she had told him, in the year before she died, that if he ever built a hideaway, he was to tell no one about it. Not her, not his sister, not his old chief, no one. And that if he ever found himself wanting to tell someone about it, he was to ask himself what hole in his own resolve was making him want to tell. He had remembered that conversation. He had asked himself the question several times during the 11 months of work. The answer had been, each time, that he was lonely. The answer had not been a reason to tell. The third reason was Earl Kendrick. From the first month Jonah had lived in Coal Run Holler, from the first month he had been looking up at the ridge and seeing the white film of slurry edge along the south face of the dam, he had known, in the slow, unspectacular way an experienced operator knows when an environment is going to test him, that the silt pond was going to fail at some point during his tenure on the parcel, and that when it failed, Earl Kendrick would know in advance, and that when it failed, the population of Coal Run Holler was going to need a place to go to ground in a hurry, and that if Earl Kendrick knew Jonah had built such a place, Earl Kendrick would either commandeer it for his own family or, more likely, given the man's documented public conversation at the diner counter and his nearly 30 years of company loyalty, would warn the company to keep the pond's failure quiet for the additional 6 hours that meant the difference between a recoverable evacuation and a fatal one. Earl was going to find out about the cellar. That was inevitable. The question was when and on whose timing. The chief had decided on the evening of the 28th of June, after Earl's third pass at the gate, that the answer to that question was probably no more than a week away. He banked the oil lamp on the kitchen table and walked out onto the porch with Hazel at his hip. The fireflies were still moving in the rhododendron. Above the trees on the south side of the hollow, the sky was the deep mineral blue of a McDowell County summer night, the kind of blue that had no equivalent in any other place he had ever been stationed, and the ridgeline above the impoundment was a black, uneven seam against it. He could not, from the porch, see the dam itself. He could see the line of the ridge that hid it. He stood on the porch in the dark with his hand on Hazel's head, and he watched the ridge for a count of 14, same count Earl had given him, returned exactly. And then he went back inside and bolted the door. He climbed to the loft. He lay down on the camp cot that served as his bed. Hazel jumped up onto the foot of the cot and circled twice and lay down across his shins. He looked up at the chestnut rafters and the cobweb in the corner above the window and the slow shift of light on the underside of the eaves. He thought last about the autumn of 2000. He was 14 years old. His mother's older sister had been living in Inez, Kentucky, at the edge of Martin County, and Jonah had been spending the long weekend off-school days with her on a trip from Mingo down across the Tug Fork. On the morning of the 11th of October, he had been on a school bus picking up Martin County middle children along the wagon road that ran the floor of Wolf Creek, 2 valleys down from his aunt's house, because the aunt's neighbor boy was the same age, and Jonah had been riding the route with him as a courtesy. The bus had not crossed the creek at the low bridge because the creek had not been water. The creek had been a moving wall of black slurry, 6 feet thick. It had been moving slowly because it was viscous, and it had been moving fast because there was a lot of it. The driver of the bus, a woman named Mavis Tooley, had stopped the bus on the upgrade and had turned around in her seat and had looked at the 31 children behind her, and she had said, in a voice he would remember the rest of his life for the way it had not shaken at all, Nobody is to get off this bus until I say so. He had looked out the window at the black, moving creek, and he had counted, very quietly, the houses he could see along the holler floor that the black water was already inside, and he had stopped counting at 12. The Inez impoundment failure, October 11th, 2000. 306 million gallons of coal slurry into the Tug Fork, 30 times the volume by gallon of the Exxon Valdez. The largest single release of industrial waste in the recorded history of the eastern United States. The slurry had killed every aquatic organism in 75 miles of the river system. It had not killed any human beings. It had not killed any human beings only because it had happened in early morning rather than late night, and because the dam had failed at the bottom of the impoundment rather than at the top, sending the slurry down through the abandoned drift mine below the pond rather than over the front face of the dam. The pond above Coal Run Holler, the big branch impoundment that Earl Kendrick had been managing for the past 11 years, was, per the most recent MSHA filing in the public record, holding 212 million gallons of coal slurry. Jonah lay on the cot in the dark, and he listened to Hazel's breathing slow towards sleep, and he did not sleep. At 4:15 the next morning, an hour before any decent rooster in Coal Run Holler had cleared its throat, a beat-up Chevy S10 with a dragging tailpipe came down the gravel cut at 32 miles an hour and stopped sideways across Jonah's gate with the headlights on. The driver opened his door and stood in the wash of his own beams and shouted something at the cabin that did not, at that distance and that volume, resolve into words. Hazel was on the porch before Jonah was. Jonah had been on the cot in his shorts when she had moved, and the movement had taken him from a thin, gray half-sleep to fully oriented inside 2 seconds, and he had been at the foot of the loft ladder in jeans and a t-shirt, and on the porch with the Mossberg 12-gauge cracked open across his forearm, inside another 15. He was barefoot. He had not had time for boots. The boots could wait until he knew what he was looking at. What he was looking at was a man he knew. Coy Tilley, 38 years old, lifetime resident of Coal Run Holler, father of 2, former roof bolter for Pocahontas Coal Resources, lost his right leg below the knee in a section cave incident in the South Mains of No. 7 Drift in March of 2019, drew workman's comp for 19 months, lost the comp in 2021 when the company medical reviewer determined his ongoing physical therapy non-compliance constituted abandonment of the rehabilitation plan, currently surviving on his wife's wages from a Walmart distribution center in Bluefield, and on what his neighbors would loan him. Father of, among others, a 7-year-old girl named B, who walked past Jonah's gate twice each weekday on her way to and from the school bus pickup at the foot of the holler. Coy was drunk. He was also, by the slack way his shoulders were carrying his arms, and by the small, high tremor in his voice that Jonah recognized from his own bad year after Lena. 3 days into a particular kind of withdrawal Jonah did not need to name to know. He had a hammer in his right hand. He was using the hammer the way a drunk man uses a hammer, which is to say he was waving it more than he was holding it. "Brick!" he shouted. "Brick! I got something to say to you." Jonah did not answer. Hazel, beside him on the porch, was completely still. Her hackles were not up. That was, the chief had told me once, the Lackland tell that mattered. A working dog whose hackles came up was a dog who had decided the threat was simple. A working dog who kept the hackles flat and watched and breathed slow was a dog who was reading more than the volume. "I said I got something to say," Coy shouted. He took 2 steps forward, stopped, swayed, recovered, and took a 3rd step. Jonah opened his mouth and closed it again. He was thinking. He had options. He could let Coy come up to the porch and say his piece, which would mean letting him onto the parcel with the hammer. He could speak across the gate and let Coy yell back, which would mean adding to the noise that was about to wake the rest of the holler. He could raise the Mossberg, which would change the conversation entirely, and which he did not want to do, because raising a long gun at Coy Tilley in late June 2026 at 4:18 in the morning was the kind of choice that ended with state troopers and incident reports and his name on a list. And Jonah had a small, careful interest in keeping his name off of lists. He chose, after a count of 4, the 4th option. He stepped down off the porch barefoot onto the dirt of the dooryard, leaned the cracked Mossberg against the porch post, walked to the gate without hurrying, and stopped 6 feet inside it. "Coy," he said. Coy stopped. He held the hammer out at arm's length. You stay over there." "I am over here," Jonas said. He kept his voice level. "I'm not coming through the gate." Earl Kendrick said, You've been writing things down." Hazel, at Jonah's heel, made a sound so small that Coy did not hear it. Jonah heard it. It was not a growl, it was the small intake of breath that meant she had located the actual center of the situation, which was not Coy and not the hammer, but Earl Kendrick's name in Coy's mouth at 4:18 in the morning. "What things would I be writing down, Coy?" Earl said, "He said you've been writing about the pond." "All right. He said you've been spotting on the pond." "Did he? He said you was the kind of man wants something to happen so you can be the one to write it down. He said—" Coy lost the thread. He squinted at his own hand, the one with the hammer. He lowered the hammer. "He said you was wanting it to fail." Jonah did not answer for a count of 6. He looked past Coy, across the gravel cut, up the ridge to where the ridgeline was just beginning to show against the very first cold light shift of pre-dawn. He could not see the dam from the gate. He knew where it was within a degree of arc. "Earl said all that," Jonah said. "He did." "When?" "Yesterday, at the diner." "Was anybody else there?" Coy thought about this. He scratched his neck with the hand that had the hammer in it. Wendell Pruitt was at the counter. Wendell didn't say nothing. "What time?" 11, maybe. Jonah nodded once. He did not say anything for another count of 6. Then he said, "Coy, B is sleeping right now." Coy's whole body went still in a way that suggested the name of his daughter had crossed a kind of threshold inside him that Earl Kendrick's name had not. He stared at Jonah, his hammer hand lowered another inch. "What's B got to do with anything?" Coy said. "She walks past my gate at 7:35 every morning. She'll walk past in 3 hours and 10 minutes. If you go home now, and you sleep this off, and you tell your wife in the morning that I was civil to you, then your daughter walks past my gate, the same as she did yesterday and the day before. If you keep shouting, then your daughter walks past my gate to find her father in a state trooper's back seat, or worse. And B is going to remember the morning her father got himself arrested on the dirt outside the brick cabin for the rest of her life. I'm asking you to think about that." Coy did not move. The hammer in his hand drifted lower until it was hanging at his side. That's not fair," he said. "It isn't," Jonah said. "But it's true." There was a long count. Coy took 1 step backwards. He looked at the hammer in his hand as though he had only just noticed he was carrying it. He turned and walked back to the S10 and dropped the hammer into the bed of the truck with a flat metallic thump. He stood beside the open driver's door for a long moment, looking at the ground. "Brick." "Yes." Earl said— Coy started and stopped. He squinted at the dirt. "Earl said he didn't want trouble. He said if you was going to make trouble, he'd—" The sentence trailed off into nothing. "He'd what, Coy?" "I don't remember." "All right. I'm going." "Go on, then." Coy got into the S10. He took 2 tries to get the door closed. He started the engine. He backed out of the gate, scraped the tailpipe loud across the lip of the gravel cut, swung around in a wide 3-point turn at the foot of the road, and drove off back up the holler toward his own place, at a speed that was not fast enough to be reckless and not slow enough to be calm. Jonah stood at the gate for a count of 40 after the sound of the truck had faded. The first thrush of the morning started up in the rhododendron behind the cabin. The light on the ridge had moved another half degree. Hazel sat at his heel and watched the gate and did not relax. In the chief's later telling of this moment to me, we were at the trestle table on his porch, the following October, with Hazel under the table and a cup of black coffee between his hands. He said the thing that had mattered most about the 418 visit was not the hammer, and not Coy, and not even the leaked diner conversation. The thing that had mattered most was the timing. Earl Kendrick had said his piece at the Welch Diner at 11 o'clock the previous morning. That was Wednesday. Coy Tilley had arrived at Jonah's gate at 4:18 the following morning, Thursday. That was a 17-hour gap. Coy was a holler man and a drunk, but Coy was not a fool. A holler man who was angry enough to drive drunk to a neighbor's gate at 4:18 in the morning was, in Jonah's experience, a man who had been working on the anger for several days and had finally found the spark. The spark had not been Earl's diner speech. The spark, Jonah suspected, had been something Earl had said to Coy directly, in person, at some point between 11 o'clock Wednesday morning and 3:30 Thursday morning. And Earl Kendrick did not, in the ordinary run of Coal Run Holler, drive down to Coy Tilley's house to talk to him at midnight unless Earl Kendrick wanted something from Coy Tilley that he could not get any other way. The thing Earl Kendrick wanted from Coy Tilley, Jonah thought, was the thing he was now telling Coy that Jonah Brick was responsible for. A man does not get spun up by his neighbors about his trouble unless his neighbors are being made to think his trouble is somebody else's fault. Earl was building a story. The story he was building was that the Silt Pond foreman had warned the Holler in late June 2026 about the outsider Navy man up on the bench above Coal Run, who had been spotting on the pond and writing things down, and who, when the pond came down, was going to be revealed as the one whose interference had caused or accelerated the failure. That was an interesting story for Earl Kendrick to be building. It was an interesting story for Earl Kendrick to be building because it was the kind of story a man builds when he knows what is going to happen and wants to be sure the blame goes somewhere other than himself. The chief stood at his gate barefoot in the McDowell County dawn with a Belgian Malinois at his heel, and he did the small private calculation that men who have run operations against capable adversaries learn to do, and he came to a number. The number was a window. The window was, by his best read, between 3 and 9 days. I owe you an explanation of why Jonah had built the way he had built. The cellar is not, in itself, an unusual feature of an Appalachian cabin. There are cellars under half the old company houses in McDowell County. There are root cellars under nearly all of the farm cabins from before 1920. What was unusual about Jonah's cellar, what set it apart structurally and operationally from any cellar within 30 miles, was a series of small, deliberate engineering choices that, taken together, made the difference between a hole in the ground where a family went to wait out a storm and a hide that could hold 8 people for 40 hours through a slurry release with no exterior assistance. I'm going into the engineering detail here for 2 reasons. The first reason is that you, the listener, are owed the truth of how a thing was built, because the way a thing is built is the only argument it ever makes for itself. The second reason is that I have walked the cellar twice now since the events of July 1st, and I have stood in the dark of it with my hand on the 1894 sandstone of the rear wall, and I owe Elias Brick of the 48th Pennsylvania the courtesy of saying out loud what he and his great-great-grandson, by separate hands across 131 years, accomplished beneath that hearth. So, the cellar's first feature is its position. Coal Run Holler, like most McDowell County hollers, runs roughly north-south, with the creek along the bottom and the wagon road on the east bank and the houses set back on small benches above the creek. The Big Branch Impoundment sits on the ridge that forms the western wall of the upper holler, about 3,000 feet upgrade and a 1.25 mile line of sight from Jonah's cabin. If the impoundment fails on its downstream face, the slurry travels first down the impoundment's outflow channel, a corrugated steel culvert that runs along the original drift mine added at the base of the dam, and then enters the head of Coal Run, where it spreads to fill the holler's floor, and continues south to the mouth of the holler at the Tug Fork, 3 miles distant. Jonah's cabin sits on the east bank bench, 46 feet of elevation above the holler floor. The cellar floor sits 12 feet below the cabin floor, which puts the cellar floor 34 feet above the holler floor. A slurry release of the volume the Big Branch Impoundment is currently holding. Call it 212 million gallons as a working number, though I have reason to believe the actual figure is higher, would, if released catastrophically, fill the holler floor to a depth of between 18 and 26 feet, depending on how much of the slurry hung up in the upper holler rather than draining south. 18 to 26 feet against 34 feet of clearance. The cellar would not flood, but, and this is the part the casual viewer misses, the cellar's structural integrity in a slurry event does not depend on whether the slurry reaches the cellar floor. It depends on whether the slurry, having reached the cabin, exerts hydraulic pressure on the upstream face of the cabin's foundation strong enough to push fluid mass through the sandstone wall of the cellar from the side. The sandstone wall of the cellar that faces the holler, the west wall, sits 4 feet below grade on its exterior face. If the holler floor flooded to 26 feet, then 22 feet of slurry stood against the upper 4 feet of the cellar's west wall, and the differential head pressure across that wall was on the order of 9.5 pounds per square inch, which was within the load tolerance of a competently repointed 1894 sandstone wall, but which was uncomfortably close to the limit. So Jonah had buttressed. I will explain what he had buttressed with because the answer is good. He had bought in the autumn of 2025 from a state surplus auction at the Beckley Equipment Yard 11 railroad cross ties of pressure-treated southern pine, each 8 feet long and weighing 178 pounds at the time of purchase. He had hauled them up to the cabin in 3 trips with a borrowed flatbed. He had dug against the exterior west wall of the cellar a trench 4 feet deep and 3 feet wide, running the full 11-foot length of the wall, and he had laid the ties horizontally in the trench, stacked in 3 courses, with the bottom course laid against compacted clay and the upper 2 courses laid against the sandstone itself. He had then backfilled the trench with the same compacted clay he had taken out of it, plus a layer of crushed limestone for drainage, and he had regraded the exterior surface so that, from the outside, the cabin looked exactly as it had before he had touched it. The result was that the cellar's west wall, in the event of a slurry head pressure event, was now backed by 11 cross ties of pressure-treated southern pine arranged in a load distribution matrix that spread any incoming hydraulic pressure across roughly 33 vertical square feet of bearing surface. Even at the high end of the calculated head pressure, call it 11 pounds per square inch against the upper 4 feet of the buried wall, the cross-tie matrix would hold the wall for at least 40 hours, after which point a number of other variables would come into play, including the slurry's rate of dewatering and the question of whether the access from the surface would still be passable. That was the engineering decision the casual observer would have missed. That was the decision that turned a hidden cellar into a survivable hide. There were others. The second feature was air. A cellar of 48 square feet of floor area and a ceiling height of 6 feet 4 inches has a total interior volume of 304 cubic feet. A single human being at rest consumes oxygen at a rate that depletes a closed volume of 304 cubic feet to the level at which carbon dioxide buildup begins to cause symptoms, headache, drowsiness, eventual unconsciousness, in approximately 11 hours, assuming the human is not exerting and is not hyperventilating from fear. 8 human beings in the same volume reach the same point in roughly 83 minutes. This is not a hide. This is a coffin. So Jonah had ventilated. He had ventilated through the chimney. The chimney mass, which already served as the upper access shaft, also served, and here's where the design begins to be elegant, as the cellar's air handling system. The mass had a vertical interior shaft 18 inches by 12 inches in cross-section, which Jonah had partitioned with a sheet metal divider into 2 parallel channels of 9 by 12 inches each. The forward channel carried the stovepipe and exhausted upward to the chimney cap as a normal stove flue. The rear channel was a dedicated ventilation duct that drew air down from a screened intake at the top of the chimney, past a small hand-cranked 12-volt blower mounted at the upper end of the cellar access shaft, and into the cellar through a wall vent set above shelf 1. In passive operation, the duct provided natural draft of approximately 14 cubic feet per minute, which was enough for 2 people indefinitely. In active operation, with the hand crank turning the blower at 30 revolutions per minute, the duct moved 68 cubic feet per minute, which was enough for 8 people indefinitely. The crank could be turned in shifts of 15 minutes by anyone with 1 functioning arm. The slurry release scenario complicated this. A slurry that reached the cabin and overtopped the chimney intake would shut off the active vent immediately. But the chimney intake was set 38 feet above the cabin floor, at the top of the chimney, which put it 66 feet above the holler floor and 40 feet above the predicted maximum slurry crest. Unless the slurry release exceeded any volume that the impoundment had any conceivable capacity to deliver, the chimney intake would remain clear. That was the second feature, air. The third feature was water. The water question was simpler in concept than the air question, but harder in execution. 18 carboys of 5 gallons each gave Jonah 90 gallons of stored drinking water. At a survival ration of 1/2 gallon per person per day, that quantity sustained 8 people for 22 and 1/2 days. At a more livable ration of 1 full gallon per person per day, 16 people for 5 and 1/2 days, or 8 people for 11 days. Either way, the time horizon was more than sufficient for the 40-hour scenario. But the carboys took up most of Shelf 1 and half of Shelf 2, and they accounted for nearly 1,000 pounds of dead weight in a structure whose floor was banked clay over crushed limestone. And they required quarterly rotation, and the chief had not been certain, when he first set them in, whether they were the right answer. The right answer, structurally, would have been to identify a clean groundwater source available to the cellar from below. Such a source did not present itself naturally. The cellar sat above the water table by a margin of, by Jonah's measurement on a hand-augured test hole he had driven in the dooryard in May of 2025, 14 feet. To reach the water table from the cellar would have required driving a well point 14 feet through banked clay and into the regional aquifer, which was not, in any rational engineering sense, worth the trouble for a 40-hour hide. So he had compromised. The 18 carboys were the working answer. The bottom of the cellar, the lowest point of the floor against the west wall, where Jonah had sloped the floor with a 1/4-inch fall over the full 11-foot length, had a small French drain that ran to a sump pit. The sump pit contained at any given moment between 2 and 4 gallons of seepage water from the surrounding soil. This water was not drinkable as drawn, but it was, in a sufficiently long emergency, available for boiling and basic decontamination, and it gave the cellar a passive water collection capacity that supplemented the stored carboys. The chief had also, at his sister's husband's suggestion during the October 2025 visit, installed a single roof runoff diverter on the cabin's downhill eave that fed into a 40-gallon food-grade plastic drum stored under the porch. The drum gave him another 40 gallons of rough water available for boiling, on top of the 90 stored gallons of treated drinking water in the cellar. He had not, in any of his planning, made allowance for the question of whether one of the 8 people in the cellar would be a 7-year-old girl with diabetic shock symptoms, requiring insulin within the first 18 hours of the event, because there was no reasonable way to plan for the specific identity of the 8 people. He had stocked pediatric insulin in the medical case, 2 preloaded autopens of glargine and 2 of aspart, plus a small rigid case of test strips and a glucometer, because Lena had taught him, 3 years before she died, that when you write a packing list for a casualty kit, you should write it for the worst case rather than the average case. And that meant you included pediatric insulin even when you did not know a child. That was the third feature: water, and by extension, the medical case. There were 6 more features. I will, for the sake of your time and my own, summarize them rather than walking through each in detail. Heat: a small Coleman backpacking stove for boiling, 2 backup canisters of butane, no open flame heat source because the cellar's volume was small, and the chief was not interested in adding combustion atmosphere to the air handling equation. Sanitation: a 5-gallon bucket toilet with sealed liner bags, a roll of toilet paper in a moisture-proof tin, a small bottle of unscented bleach. Light: a single kerosene lamp on a shelf plus 4 LED headlamps charged off the hand-crank dynamo, plus a single chemical light stick taped to the back wall as a worst-case last resort. Communication: the hand-cranked AM/FM shortwave receiver, plus a 4-watt CB radio with a magnetic mount antenna that Jonah had routed up through the chimney mass and out through the chimney cap in a small dedicated conduit. Security: ammunition for 3 weapons, plus the SIG P229 on the chief's hip during the event itself, plus a length of 3/8 chain that could be used to padlock the underside of the hearth flagstone from inside the cellar in the event that the front access needed to be sealed against intrusion from above. And finally, perhaps most importantly, routine. The chief had, over the 11 months of construction, done 1 full dry run exercise per month. He had set a kitchen timer for the entry sequence. Lift the hearth flagstone, pull the 3 soft red bricks, lower into the cellar shaft, replace the bricks from below, lower the flagstone from below using a small loop of nylon cord he had set into the underside of the flagstone. 8 seconds, dry, with Hazel coming down on his shoulders for the last 6 inches of the descent. He had done the same exercise from the upper access. Push aside the iron damper plate, slide down the rebar rungs, secure the fire brick course behind himself. 11 seconds. He had timed both routes against the question of how many people he could move through them in 2 minutes. The answer was 4 through the front route and 2 through the rear route, for a combined 6-person, 2-minute capacity, with 2 people remaining to be moved in the 3rd minute. He had done all of this alone in the cabin in the long winter evenings of 2025 and the cool spring evenings of 2026. He had not, in 11 months, told Hazel why she was being asked to descend through a hearth flagstone or push past a damper plate. She had learned the routines because he had taught them to her, in the way that working dogs are taught, with short, repetitive sessions and small, precise rewards, and the calm, steady presence of the man who had been her 3rd handler and was now her first home. She had not asked why. Dogs do not. I have walked the cellar twice, as I said, and I am going to make one observation about it that did not occur to me on the first walk, and that struck me hard on the second. The cellar's interior, in the small movement of the kerosene lamplight against the 1894 sandstone, is the most carefully restored room of the 1890s American homesteader experience I have ever stood inside. The sandstone is original. The chestnut shelving is salvage from the same parcel. The hot lime mortar is mixed by a method documented in the National Park Service's Historic Restoration Handbook for late Victorian Appalachian masonry. The ventilation duct is sized to a calculation a competent civil engineer would recognize. The thermal mass of the chimney provides passive heating in winter and passive cooling in summer that maintains the cellar at between 58 and 64 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. There is no electricity in the cellar that is not, on the day of an event, generated by hand inside the cellar itself. The cellar is also Elias bricks. The walls are his. The hearth flagstone is his. The original sealed access, the soft red brick course Jonah had to remove to find his way in, was Elias Brick's deliberate post-finishing seal, executed sometime after the cellar was no longer in use, probably during the long final winter of his black lung condition. Probably for the reason that a man who has been at the crater seals a hole he is no longer strong enough to defend. Jonah Brick had not, in our conversation, framed his work that way. The chief is not a man who frames work that way. But on my second walk through the cellar, I stood with my hand against the rear sandstone wall, the part of the wall Elias Brick had laid in 1894 against the cut bank above the creek, and I thought about the great-great-grandson and the great-great-grandfather sealing and unsealing the same hole across 131 years. And I thought about how the country that had asked Elias Brick to dig a tunnel under Confederate works in 1864, and that had asked Jonah Brick to clear compounds in 3 Iraqi cities between 2005 and 2017, had also, by the working of certain less examined institutional habits, made the failure of a silt pond foreman in McDowell County in 2026 into a thing for which men of that line had quietly and competently prepared themselves to be of use. That is what I thought on my second walk through Elias Brick's cellar. I cannot confirm the chief would agree. Coytilly's S10 had been gone for 30 minutes when the school bus came down the road. Jonah had by then gone back inside, made coffee on the small countertop electric burner he kept beside the stove, fed Hazel, eaten 2 pieces of toast with butter, and pulled on boots and a clean t-shirt. He was standing at the kitchen window with the mug of coffee in his hand when B. Tilly came down the gravel cut on her way to the bus. She was 7, and she had thick, dark hair cut short at her shoulders, and she was wearing a cotton dress patterned with small yellow flowers, and she was carrying a canvas school bag that was too large for her. She came down the gravel cut in the unhurried way that holler children come to the bus, and when she reached the gate, she stopped the way she always did, and she looked up at the cabin. Hazel was at the kitchen window beside Jonah. Hazel had, in the 8 months Jonah had been permanently in the cabin, come to recognize B. Tilly's walk past the gate as a small daily ceremony that did not require any action from her, but that the dog watched the way a working dog watches anything that comes within 40 feet of her handler and is not on a list of things she has been told to ignore. B was not on the ignore list. B was, on Hazel's internal accounting, an unresolved matter. That morning, the morning after Coy Tilly had been at the gate with a hammer at 4:18, B stopped at the gate longer than usual. She stood with one hand on the gatepost and the other hand on the strap of her school bag, and she looked up at the cabin, and she did not move. Then she walked through the open gate. She did this with the deliberate dignity of a 7-year-old who is doing something her parents have explicitly forbidden her to do, and who has decided, with the seriousness available only to 7-year-olds in such moments, that she is going to do it anyway. She came up the gravel cut to within 6 feet of the porch. She stopped. She looked at the cabin door. She did not knock. Jonah, at the kitchen window, did not move. B waited, in the doorway yard sense rather than the porch step sense, for perhaps 30 seconds. Then in a voice he could only just hear through the closed window, she said, "Mister." Jonah set the coffee mug down. He opened the kitchen door slowly. He did not step out. Hazel beside him did not step out either. Jonah understood, in the way he had learned to understand such things from Lena before he had learned them from Hazel, that what was happening at the foot of his porch step was not a thing to be hurried. "Yes, B." She looked up at him. Her eyes were a pale gray-green that he had not been close enough to notice before. They were also entirely steady, in the way the eyes of certain 7-year-olds in difficult families become steady earlier than the eyes of other children. "My daddy was here this morning," she said. "Was he polite to you?" Jonah took a breath. He held it for a count of 2. He let it out. "Yes, B," he said. "Your daddy was polite to me." She nodded once, the way an adult nods when receiving an expected piece of information. "Thank you," she said. "I have to go to the bus now." She turned. She walked back down the gravel cut. At the gate, she looked back once, briefly, at the porch and at Jonah, and at the door he was holding half open. She did not wave. She turned and walked the rest of the way to the school bus stop at the foot of the holler, at the unhurried pace she had set when she had come down the road in the first place. Jonah watched her until she was out of sight. Then he closed the kitchen door, walked to the table, sat down, and put his face in his hands for a count he did not bother to keep. Hazel, beside the chair, pushed her head under his elbow and held it there. The window was, the chief told me that October, between 3 and 9 days. The window had been between 3 and 9 days the night before, when Earl Kendrick had walked away from his gate. The conversation with Coy at 418 had not narrowed the window. The 7-year-old at the gate at 7:35 had not narrowed the window either. But the 7-year-old had, the chief said, and here he stopped his coffee mug halfway to his mouth and put it back down on the trestle table. The 7-year-old had moved the small thing inside him that he had not, in any of his 11 months of work in the cabin, accounted for. He had built the cellar against the foreseeable failure of an industrial impoundment, whose retention margin he had been quietly studying for 9 months. He had stocked the cellar for the people he could foresee being in it on the day of the event, which was himself and Hazel and possibly, on a generous reading of his sister's travel schedule, his sister and her husband. He had not, in any of his planning, stocked it for the daughter of the man who had come to his gate with a hammer. He sat at his kitchen table for some considerable portion of that Thursday morning, and he thought about B. Tilly standing 6 feet from his porch step asking whether her father had been polite. And he thought about the school bus on Wolf Creek Holler on the morning of October 11th, 2000. And he thought about Mavis Tooley, the bus driver, telling 31 children that nobody was to get off this bus until she said so. He got up from the table. He walked across to the hearth. He lifted the flagstone and the 3 soft red bricks. He climbed down into the cellar. He spent the rest of that morning re-inventorying the pediatric medical supplies and adding 3 additional 5-gallon carboys of drinking water that he hauled up from the truck after a drive down to the Welch Hardware. He pulled the sterile birthing kit out of the case and confirmed its contents and resealed it. He pulled out the pediatric insulin auto pens and checked their expiry dates and rotated 2 of the older ones for fresh stock from a bag he had brought back from the hardware. He added a child's wool blanket, folded inside a vacuum-sealed bag that he had bought at the Welch consignment store on his way back, on the chance that a 7-year-old in a hide for 40 hours would need something soft to lie on that was not the bare clay floor. He did not, in any of this, change any feature of the cellar that mattered structurally. He changed only the small things that the cellar's eventual occupants would touch with their hands and feel against their skin. He worked quietly. Hazel sat at the bottom of the front access shaft and watched him. She did not, for the first time in 11 months, descend with him. She stayed at the shaft and she watched. When he was finished, he climbed up out of the cellar, replaced the bricks, replaced the flagstone, washed his hands at the kitchen sink, and went out to the porch with a fresh cup of coffee. He sat on the porch step. Hazel lay across his right boot. The sun was nearly over the eastern ridge. The ridge above the impoundment, on the western side of the holler, was still in shadow. He could not, from the porch, see the dam. He could feel it, though. He had been able to feel it for 9 months. And on the morning of the 29th of June, with the school bus pulling away down at the foot of Coal Run Holler, and a 7-year-old girl on it whose gray-green eyes he had only just learned the color of, he could feel it more clearly than he ever had. The window was between 3 and 9 days. The chief sat on his porch step with his coffee, and he set the window, in his own mind, at 4. Hazel came off the porch at a dead run at 3 minutes past 2 on Sunday afternoon, the 3rd of July, 2026. She did not bark. She had never been a barker. She came off the porch from a sound sleep on the rag rug in front of the stove, through the open kitchen door, across the dooryard, and to the gate in something under 5 seconds. And when she reached the gate, she stopped, pressed her chest against the bars, and turned her muzzle up the holler toward the ridge above Big Branch. Her hackles were up. Her hackles had not been up for 14 months. Her tail was held low and straight. Jonah was on the porch with a sandwich in his hand and the noon news on the hand-cranked shortwave at low volume. And he had been listening to the news with one ear and watching the dooryard with the other eye for the entire afternoon, because he had set the window in his own mind at 4 days on Thursday morning, and Sunday afternoon was day 4, and he had been waiting to find out whether he had been right or wrong. He set the sandwich down on the porch step. He stood up. He walked, not ran, to the gate. He did not at first hear anything. He stood at the gate with one hand on the top bar and the other hand on Hazel's withers, and he listened the way the BUD/S instructor I had trained under had once taught us to listen on a low light line. Open your jaw, breathe through your mouth, do not subvocalize, hold for a count of 5. He held for 5. On the 6th count, he heard it. The sound was at the very limit of what a human ear can detect. It was not, strictly speaking, a sound at all yet. It was a pressure change in the air. It was the pressure change that a very large volume of moving water makes against the air column of a holler, a long time before the water itself arrives. It was, the chief would tell me in October, the sound a holler makes when 500 million gallons of black water decide to leave their pond at the same time. Hazel had heard it 7 minutes before he had. He turned and walked back toward the cabin at a pace that was neither slow nor fast. He went up onto the porch. He picked up the sandwich, wrapped it in the wax paper it had come out of, and set it on the windowsill. He went inside. He shut the kitchen door behind him. He walked across to the kitchen table where the shortwave was still murmuring the noon news, and he turned it off. He walked to the corner of the room where the Mossberg was leaning against the wall. He had taken to keeping it there since Coy's visit, and he picked it up. He carried it to the hearth. Then he stood for a count of 3 with the Mossberg in his right hand and his left hand flat on the chimney mass, and he made the calculation he had been making, in one form or another, every morning for the previous 9 months. The calculation was, who was within reach? Within line of sight of his porch, on the gravel cut that ran past his gate down to the foot of the holler, the families he could put hands on within 12 minutes were the following. The Tillies, Coy, his wife Marlene, and their 2 children B and Davis. Davis was 4. At the second house from the foot of the holler, 0.6 of a mile downgrade and 1 minute by truck. 4 people. The Hatfield Mullins place. Old Wendell Pruitt's nephew Royce Hatfield and his second wife Anita Mullins. No children. 3rd house up from the foot of the holler, 0.4 of a mile downgrade. 2 people. The Boykins. Maureen Boykin, widow of a long-haul trucker who had died of liver cancer in 2023, and her grown daughter Charlene, who had moved home to look after her. At the 4th house up the holler, 0.3 downgrade. 2 people. Beyond the Boykins, going down the holler toward the Tug Fork, the next 4 households were people Jonah did not know well enough to be certain of finding home at 3 on a Sunday afternoon in July. He set them aside. Going up the holler from his own parcel, that is, toward the ridge above which the impoundment sat, there were 2 more households. One was the Kendricks. The other was a Carr family in a single-wide trailer who had moved in the previous October and whom Jonah had spoken to exactly once. He set both aside, for different reasons. 8 people. Tilly's 4, Hatfield Mullins 2, Boykins 2. 8 people he could reach by truck inside 12 minutes, get back to the cabin inside 25, get into the cellar inside 35, sealed inside 40. The chief would tell me later that he had run the same math 3 times the previous Thursday afternoon, after B. Tilly had come back from school and had walked past his gate the second time of the day without looking up at the cabin. He had run it again on Friday morning. He had run it again on Saturday at noon. He had run it the third time against the question of whether 8 people would fit in his cellar. The honest answer on Saturday had been that they would fit, but they would be uncomfortable. The honest answer on Sunday at 3 minutes past 2 was that the question had stopped being interesting. He picked up his truck keys from the bowl on the kitchen table. He whistled Hazel into the passenger footwell. He locked the cabin behind him. The Tilly house was a single-wide manufactured home set on cinder blocks on a flat cut into the east bank of Coal Run, 0.6 of a mile downgrade from Jonah's parcel. Coy's S10 was in the dirt yard with the hood up. Coy himself was leaning under the hood with a wrench in his hand. He looked up when Jonah's truck came around the bend. Jonah did not slow down enough to be misread. He came up the drive at 15 miles an hour, stopped 6 feet short of the S10, and got out. Coy! Brick. Coy's voice was flat. The hammer drunk of Thursday morning was not in him. He looked tired. He had a smear of black grease across his right cheekbone. Where's Marlene? Inside. B and Davis. Inside. Coy, the pond is going. Coy did not move for a count of 2. He looked at Jonah. He looked at the wrench in his hand. He looked at the dooryard. He set the wrench very carefully on the radiator support. He straightened up. He wiped his hands on the front of his coveralls. How long? I don't know. Inside the hour, possibly inside 10 minutes. I felt the pressure change on the gate 7 minutes ago. You felt what? I'll explain in the truck. Go get Marlene and the kids. Now, Coy. Coy did not ask any of the questions a man might have asked at that moment. He did not ask whether Jonah was sure. He did not ask whether Earl Kendrick had said anything. He did not ask whether the company had given any warning. He turned and walked across the dooryard, mounted the cinder block step at the front door, and went inside the trailer. Jonah waited at the truck with the engine running. He could hear, through the open driver's window, the rising note of the wind in the chestnut oaks behind the trailer. The wind was wrong. It was wrong in the small way the wind had been wrong on the morning of October 11th, 2000, on the school bus on Wolf Creek Holler. He had been 14 years old. He had not understood then what the wind was telling him. He understood it now. Coy came out of the trailer with Davis under his left arm. The boy was sleepy, half-dressed, blinking against the daylight, and Marlene came behind him with B by the hand. Marlene Tilly was 35, broad-shouldered, with her brown hair pulled back in a working knot, wearing jeans and a faded blue work shirt over a Walmart name tag. She did not, on coming out into the dooryard and seeing Jonah at the gate of his own truck, ask a single question. She took one look at Coy's face and one look at Jonah's face, and she put B into the back seat of Jonah's truck, and she lifted Davis from Coy's arm and put him in beside B, and she got in beside the children. Coy got in the front. He slammed the door. Where to? My place, the cellar. You got a cellar? Yes. Earl said, Earl was wrong, Coy. Hatfield's next, then Boykin, then home. The truck was already moving. Hazel was on the floor of the front passenger footwell, with her muzzle pressed against the side of B's knee in the back seat. B, in the back, had not made a sound. Davis, who had been half asleep, was beginning to register that something was happening, and was beginning to lean against his mother's side and to cry the small, soft cry of a 4-year-old who does not know what to be afraid of yet. The Hatfield Mullins house was 0.4 of a mile back up the holler. Jonah covered the distance in 52 seconds. Royce Hatfield was in the dooryard chopping kindling. He was 63, slow-moving, and he had been a coal camp electrician for 41 years before retirement. He had known Jonah for the entirety of Jonah's tenure in the holler. He looked up when the truck pulled in. He saw the load in the back seat. He saw Marlene Tilly's face. He set the splitting maul down at his feet without looking down to place it. He did not ask. He turned and walked to the porch and called inside, and Anita Mullins came out wiping her hands on a dish towel. Royce climbed into the bed of Jonah's truck. Anita climbed into the back seat beside Marlene. Royce stood up in the bed and braced himself against the cab. He said through the open cab window, "Maureen?" "Going there now," Jonah said. The truck was moving again. Hatfield's voice carried back through the cab. "Charlene Boykin's at work. Walmart shift. She left at noon." "Confirm." Jonah glanced at Marlene. "She did," Marlene said. "I saw her car pull out." "Then 6, Jonah said. Tilly's 4, you 2, Maureen 1. My boy Wesley's down in Bluefield." "All right." Maureen Boykin's house was 3/10 of a mile further down. She was on the porch with a glass of iced tea. She was 68 years old. She saw the truck. She saw who was in it. She did not, like Royce, ask any questions. She set the iced tea down on the porch rail, walked into the house, came out with a small canvas bag over one shoulder, and walked to the truck. She got in the back. The truck now had 6 people in the cab and 1 in the bed and a dog in the front footwell. Maureen Boykin sat against the door with her bag in her lap. B. Tilly was on Marlene's left. Davis was on Marlene's right. Anita Mullins was on Maureen's left. The 4 adults in the back had compressed themselves to make room for the 2 children. No one was speaking. Davis was no longer crying. B had not made a sound since she had been put in the truck. Jonah turned the truck around in the road in 3 movements and drove back up the holler toward his own gate. That was 8 people. Royce in the bed counted. The dog in the footwell did not. The drive back up to his cabin took 2 minutes and 18 seconds. He pulled the truck up to the porch. He did not park it in the dooryard. He stopped it broadside across the gate, blocking the gravel cut from the road. He left the engine running. He left the keys in the ignition. "Inside," he said. "Now, don't stop on the porch." Royce came down out of the bed first and lifted Davis from Marlene's lap. Marlene followed with B. Anita and Maureen came behind. Coy came last. They went up the porch step in a tight, close-quarters file that did not waste any motion. Royce had been in the Army Reserves in his 20s and had not forgotten how to move people through a doorway under pressure. Inside the cabin, Jonah did not pause for orientation. He went straight to the hearth, lifted the flagstone, pulled the 3 soft red bricks, and lowered himself feet first into the cellar shaft to receive the others. "Children first. B, you're going down with me. Davis, your mom I'll hand you to me. Royce, hand the boy down." B did not flinch. She walked to the edge of the hearth, looked down, looked at Jonah's hands held up to her, and stepped off the lip of the hearth into his arms. She was light. He set her down on the cellar floor behind him. She moved to the rear wall on her own without being told and sat down on the bench under the bookshelf. Davis was next. Royce knelt at the hearth. Davis, who was small for 4, hung in his grandfather's hands for a moment and then dropped the last 18 inches into Jonah's grip. Jonah set him down beside his sister. B took his hand without looking at him. Marlene came down using the shaft's rebar handholds. Anita followed. Maureen, who had the worst knees in the group, came down sitting on the lip of the hearth and lowering herself 1 foot at a time, with Jonah's hand under her elbow. Royce was 6th. Coy was 7th. Royce, before coming down, asked the only question anyone had asked in 7 minutes. "What about you?" "Last," Jonah said. "I'm sealing it from above." He climbed back out of the cellar, came up onto the cabin floor, and crossed to the back door. He had heard, in the previous 40 seconds, a change in the air outside the cabin that he had been waiting to confirm. He opened the back door 6 inches, listened, closed it. He locked it. He came back to the hearth. He looked down at the 7 faces in the cellar. "Listen to me," he said. "There will be a sound. The sound will be loud. The cabin above us may not hold. The cellar will hold. Stay against the rear wall. Hazel comes down with me. Royce, you're senior in the room. If anything happens to me, you get the front access closed from inside. The flagstone has a loop of cord on the underside. You pull it, the stone settles. The bricks reseat in their course on a notched fit. The cellar can be sealed from inside in under 10 seconds. Understood. Anita, you're closest to the medical case on shelf 3. If anyone needs medical, it's there. Insulin autopens, 2 strengths. I have not been able to ask whether any of you are diabetic or have other conditions. If you are, get the autopen, look at the label. Choose. My boy Davis is not diabetic. B is not. I am not. All right. Royce ain't either. He's got a heart pill in his shirt pocket. He took it after lunch. All right. Jonah looked at Maureen. Maureen, I've got blood pressure pills in my bag. I just took my morning. I'm fine for the day. All right. He looked at Coy. Coy was sitting on the cellar floor with his back against the 1894 sandstone wall and both hands on his knees. He had not said anything since the truck. He looked up at Jonah at the hearth opening. Coy? I'm clean, Coy said. 3 days. I'm clean. Jonah held the look for one count. All right. He turned, whistled Hazel down through the hearth. She came down in one fluid drop without bothering with the rebar, and then he came down himself, last. He pulled the 3 soft red bricks back into their course. He reached up, pulled the loop of nylon cord on the underside of the flagstone, and lowered the flagstone into its seat. The flagstone settled with a soft mortar-on-mortar click that he had spent a week of evenings in May 2025 tuning until it was right. The cellar went dark. He lit the kerosene lamp on the shelf. The light came up slow and yellow against the 1894 sandstone. He looked at his watch. The time was 2:14 and 46 seconds on Sunday, the 3rd of July, 2026. The sound came at 2:16. The sound was, the chief told me that October, like nothing he had ever heard. He had been in 3 Iraqi cities under indirect fire. He had been close enough to a 1,000-pound bomb impact to have his ears bleed for a week. He had been under a wing of a falling tree at 60 feet during a logging accident in West Virginia in 2025. None of those sounds had been like the sound at 2:16 on the 3rd of July. The sound at 2:16 was the sound of a column of moving fluid, the volume of a small lake, leaving a holding pond by way of a failing dam face. It was, more precisely, the sound of 212 million gallons of saturated coal slurry, actually closer to 240 million, by later FOIA-released MSHA documents, accelerating from a standing pool to a moving wall as the south face of the Big Branch impoundment failed in 3 near-simultaneous slips, beginning at the 10-year mark and propagating upward. It started as a low pulse in the chest cavity. It went, inside 3 seconds, to a sustained roar that contained inside itself the cracking of 50,000 trees in the upper holler, the implosion of 3 coal camp houses in the head of the holler, and the dull ringing of every piece of metal within a half-mile being struck simultaneously by a moving wall of saturated black water. In the cellar, beneath 34 feet of clearance and 1894 sandstone, repointed in 2025 with hot lime mortar, the sound came through as a low, complex, sustained pressure that was felt in the breastbone more than heard with the ears. Davis began to cry. Bea did not. She held Davis's hand. Marlene wrapped her arms around both of them and pressed them into her chest and against the 1894 sandstone wall and held them there. Hazel had positioned herself between Jonah, who was at the front of the cellar checking the seal on the hearth flagstone from below, and Bea Tilley, who was against the rear wall holding her brother. Hazel was lying with her chest down and her head up. Her ears were flat against her skull. Her eyes tracked the ceiling. The sound at its loudest, the chief told me, lasted between 40 and 50 seconds, and then it began to subside, the way a freight train passing a station subsides. Although the freight train, the chief said, was still passing. The wall of slurry was still moving down the holler. What had subsided was only the initial release. At 1 minute 15, the impact came. The slurry, which had traveled 3,000 feet down the impoundment outflow and entered the head of Coal Run at approximately 2:16 and 45 seconds, reached Jonah's gate at 1 minute and 15 seconds after the initial release. It hit the truck Jonah had left blocking the gate first. The truck, on the chief's later inspection, had been lifted, rolled 3 times, and deposited 200 feet downgrade against a stand of rhododendron. The truck had absorbed enough of the initial momentum that the cabin, sitting 46 feet above the holler floor on its bench, took the secondary wave rather than the primary. The secondary wave reached the cabin foundation at 1 minute and 22 seconds. It rose against the cabin's lower courses to a depth of 14 feet within 7 seconds. It crested at 21 feet at the highest point. It held above the cellar's exterior west wall buried face, which was buttressed, you will recall, by 11 railroad cross ties of pressure-treated southern pine, at 17 pounds per square inch of differential head pressure at the peak. The cross ties held. The 1894 sandstone, repointed in 2025 with hot lime mortar by a man who had read the National Park Service handbook 3 times and had practiced the joint on a fieldstone wall behind his Virginia Beach rental house before he had bought the cabin, held. The hearth flagstone settled into its seat by a man who had spent a week of evenings tuning the seal in May 2025, held. The 3 soft red bricks, reseated in their notched fit, held. The chimney mast, which had been the upper access shaft, and which had also been the cellar's ventilation system, took the slurry against its lower 9 feet of exterior surface and shed it laterally to either side. The chimney intake at the top of the chimney, 66 feet above the holler floor, remained 4 feet above the highest slurry crest of the event. Air continued at 14 cubic feet per minute on passive draft to enter the cellar. It was, in those first 7 minutes, exactly as Jonah had designed it to be. It was not, in the breathing and pulse of the 8 people in the cellar, anything anyone present had ever felt before. Davis cried for 6 minutes. Then he stopped. He pressed his face into his mother's shoulder and he slept. The cellar smelled, the chief told me, of kerosene and damp sandstone and human breath, and the small private smell of fear that had no specific source, but that came off all of them in different quantities. Marlene was steady. Anita was steady. Maureen was praying very quietly with her eyes closed. She was Pentecostal, of the older, quiet kind, and her praying was the kind that did not require any sound. Royce was, by his own description to me later, holding it together by counting the cross ties in his head. Coy was looking at his own hands. B. Tilly was sitting on the floor against the rear wall, with her brother asleep against one side and her mother's hand on her hair and the 1894 sandstone against her back. She had not made a sound through any of it. Hazel had moved. She had moved at the moment the sound had started its first descent, at about 1 minute 30 seconds, when the impact had reached the cabin and the cabin had taken the wave. She had crossed the cellar from her position at Jonah's side to the rear wall, and she had lain down beside B. Tilly, and she had put her head on B's lap. The chief told me, in October, that it was the first time in 26 months, since the night in the Memphis motel, that Hazel had voluntarily put her head on a human being who was not him. B. Tilly, who had not made a sound through any of the 7 minutes of the event, put her hand on the back of Hazel's neck and rested it there. The dog let out a slow, long sigh that everyone in the cellar heard. I want to stop the account here for a moment and tell you something I learned in October, when the chief was telling me this story across the trestle table on his porch. The chief is not a man who frames things in moral terms. He is a chief petty officer of the United States Navy, retired, who served 30 years in an organization that frames things in operational terms, and the operational frame has stayed with him. He does not say that one person is good and another person is bad. He says that one person worked and another person did not work. He does not say that one decision was right and another was wrong. He says that one decision held and another decision failed. But when he was telling me about Hazel crossing the cellar to put her head on B. Tilly's lap, he stopped his coffee mug halfway to his mouth, the way he had stopped it when telling me about B at the gate, and he held it there for a count I did not bother to keep. And then he set the coffee mug down, and he said quietly, looking out across his dooryard toward the gravel cut where the truck had once been parked sideways across the gate, "The dog knew before I did." I asked him what the dog had known. He said, "That Coy Tilly was the man who had crossed the holler at midnight on Wednesday with Earl Kendrick. That Coy Tilly was the man Earl had brought along, drunk on whatever he could find, to deliver the message that I was the problem. That Coy Tilly was, in his own quiet, broken way, a man who had been used by Earl Kendrick the way the company had been using Coy Tilly for 19 years. And that Coy Tilly's daughter, sitting on the cellar floor across from him in the lamplight, was the only person in the entire holler who had not, at any point in 8 months of being 8, lied to me or about me." He paused. The dog had figured all of that out the morning B came to the gate at 7:35 and asked whether her father had been polite. The dog had been holding it for 4 days, waiting to see if I would figure it out too. I figured it out at about minute 3 of the slurry release. The dog figured she had waited long enough. He picked up his coffee. He drank. She crossed the cellar to lie down by B, because somebody in the room needed to make a choice about whose daughter mattered, and I was busy checking the seal on the hearth, and the dog did not feel like waiting. In the cellar, at 12 minutes after the release, the sound outside had subsided to a sustained, low rumble that the chief identified as the slurry continuing to drain through the holler toward the tug fork. He climbed up to the front shaft, put his ear against the underside of the hearth flagstone, listened for 1 full minute, and came back down. He nodded at Royce. Royce nodded back. They understood each other. Jonah moved to the rear of the cellar. He squatted down beside Hazel and B. Tilly. "You're all right," he said, not as a question. B looked at him. Her gray-green eyes were entirely dry. "My daddy's clean," she said. The chief told me later that the sentence had hit him harder than any single sentence had hit him since the morning Dr. Halligan had called him about Hazel. He did not, in the moment, let any of that show. He nodded once. "I know," he said. "He told me in the truck. He has been clean since Thursday." "All right." She looked across the cellar at her father. Coy Tilly was sitting against the front wall with his head down and his hands palm up on his knees. He was not crying. He had been a man who did not cry for the entirety of his adult life, except for one occasion in March of 2019 when he had been told by the company medical reviewer that his right leg below the knee was not coming back. He was sitting with his head down because he was, in the chief's later judgment, hearing his daughter say the word clean across the cellar and was understanding, for the first time in 19 months, that his daughter had been counting the days. The chief stayed crouched beside B for another count of 4. Then he said, to the cellar at large, "Everybody comfortable enough? Royce, you take first crank shift on the blower in 15 minutes. Maureen, your shift after that. We're going to be here a while. I have stores enough. The cabin above us has probably failed. The cellar has not. We're going to be all right." He stood up. He walked back to the front of the cellar. He climbed the rebar rungs to the upper hatch and listened against the fire brick course. He could hear, through the chimney mass, the steady, sustained sound of the slurry draining south. He came back down. He sat down beside Hazel. The dog kept her head on B. Tilly's lap. It was 12 minutes and 45 seconds past the initial release of the Big Branch Impoundment, and there were 39 hours and 17 minutes left to go. I will not, in this account, take you through the full 39 hours minute by minute. The 39 hours, as the chief described them to me, were composed in roughly equal measure of 3 things. The slow work of keeping 8 bodies functional in a confined volume. The slow work of communication out of the cellar by the small 4-watt CB radio whose antenna ran up the chimney. And the slow work of waiting. I will give you the headlines. At hour 2, Jonah powered up the 4-watt CB and made contact with the McDowell County Emergency Dispatch in Welch. He gave coordinates, gave the count of 8 souls in the cellar, gave the status of the cabin above as presumed total loss, gave the calculated head pressure exposure of the cellar wall, gave his estimate of slurry crest height in the holler. The dispatcher, a woman named Patricia Hensley, whose voice the chief had heard once before on a routine welfare check call back in February, did not waste any time on disbelief. She passed the coordinates to the State Emergency Management Agency at Charleston. She told Jonah she would be back on the channel at hour 3. At hour 3, she came back. The state had confirmed the impoundment failure. The slurry had reached the tug fork at hour 2:20. 3 other hollers in the Coal Run drainage had been flooded. Casualties were being assessed. The Kendrick household, at the head of Coal Run Holler immediately below the impoundment, had been hit by the primary wave and was a total loss. 3 bodies recovered, 2 confirmed missing, one of the missing being Earl Kendrick. The car trailer at the head of the holler was also a total loss. The Carr family of 4 had been at a Sunday afternoon church service in Welch and were unhurt. At hour 5, the cellar's interior temperature, which had been at 59 degrees Fahrenheit at the moment of seal, had risen to 68 degrees from 8 bodies of metabolic heat. The blower was running at half capacity on shifted hand crank duty. Carbon dioxide was elevated, but not yet symptomatic. At hour 8, Davis Tilly woke from a 6-hour sleep, ate a small amount of cornbread and drank water, and went back to sleep against his mother's side. At hour 11, Coy Tilly, who had not moved from his position against the front wall in 11 hours, asked Jonah quietly across the cellar whether there was a Bible in the bookshelf. Jonah said no. Coy nodded. He looked at his hands. He asked whether there was a copy of the Book of Job. Jonah said there was an English translation in the Norwegian folktales volume his wife Lena had owned, in the appendix, but it was Lena's. Coy said he would not touch it. Jonah said it was all right. He got the volume down off the shelf and handed it to Coy. Coy read for 2 hours in the kerosene lamplight without speaking. When he was done, he handed the book back to Jonah and said, "Thank you." Jonah replaced the book on the shelf. At hour 14, Maureen Boykin recited very quietly the entire 90th Psalm in the King James translation she had memorized at the age of 9. No one in the cellar interrupted her. When she was done, Anita Mullins recited the 23rd Psalm in the same translation, the same way. When Anita was done, the cellar fell silent again. At hour 16, the CB radio confirmed that a Federal Emergency Management Agency search and rescue team out of the Charleston field office had reached the head of Coal Run Holler and was working its way down. They had found the Kendrick foreman's wife, Faye, who was alive, who had been found in the second-floor bedroom of the Kendrick house, which had been the only room left standing of the structure. Faye Kendrick had been in the second-floor bedroom because she had been in the late stage of stage 3 breast cancer treatment and had been unable to come down for Sunday lunch. The bedroom had survived because the second-floor framing of the Kendrick house had been built in 1923 by a Pittston Coal Company carpenter who had built it square and had not used green lumber. Faye Kendrick was hypothermic and dehydrated and uninjured. She was being evacuated. She had asked, the dispatcher told Jonah at hour 17, whether Jonah Brick's cabin had been reached. The dispatcher had told her it had not been reached yet, but that Jonah Brick was on the radio. Faye Kendrick had said, the dispatcher told Jonah, that her husband had told her on Saturday night at supper that the south face of the pond had moved 1.5 inches between Tuesday morning and Friday afternoon, and that he had told no one at the company because the company would have laid him off, and his wife would have lost her health insurance, and her treatment would have stopped. The dispatcher said this to Jonah in a flat, professional dispatcher's voice. Jonah said, "Roger that, dispatch." He turned the CB radio down. He sat for a count of 20 looking at the 1894 sandstone wall opposite him. Then he turned the radio back up, gave Patricia Hensley a status of all 8 souls remaining nominal, and told her he would be back on the channel at hour 18. He did not, in his retelling of this to me, tell me what he thought, in the count of 20 between turning the radio down and turning the radio back up. He told me only that he had thought about Earl Kendrick walking past his gate 3 times in 8 days, and that he had understood finally that all 3 passes had been a man trying and failing to find a way to say something he could not afford to say. The chief did not, when he told me this, look at me. He looked at the gravel cut where the gate had been. At hour 39 and 17 minutes, the upper hatch came open from above. Jonah heard the seal go before he heard the voices. He had been lying on the cellar floor with his back against the rear wall, his shoulder 6 inches from the warm flank of Hazel, who had not, in 39 hours, left B. Tilly's side. He was awake. He had slept in stretches of 40 minutes for the entire 39, the way a man on a long watch sleeps. When the fire brick course at the back of the firebox shifted, a low, gritty scrape of mortar dust against iron, he was on his feet inside 2 seconds. "Brick! Brick, you in there? McDowell EMS, I'm coming down." A flashlight beam moved across the rear sandstone wall. The voice was a man's. The accent was Welsh. "Confirm McDowell EMS," Jonah said. "Identify." "Tate Whitlow, Welsh Volunteer Fire. We met at the diner in March." Jonah remembered the name. He remembered the face. He remembered the conversation, which had been about whether the spring of 2026 was going to produce more morel mushrooms than the spring of 2025. "Confirmed. Send down a hand if you can spare it. I have 8 souls, including 2 children. Stove route is open from your side." "Coming." A young man in a turnout coat and a yellow helmet came down the rebar rungs at speed. He had a coil of webbing over one shoulder and an oxygen meter in his hand and a headlamp on his helmet that he had clipped to medium beam. He stepped off the bottom rung into the lamplight of the cellar, and he stopped for a count of 1 as he registered what he was looking at. 8 people. 3 on the rear bench, 3 on the cross bench, 2 on the floor. A black and tan Belgian Malinois lying across a 7-year-old girl's lap. A kerosene lamp on a chestnut shelf. 14 books on the shelf behind the lamp, the smell of clean human breath and damp sandstone, and slow, steady time. "Brother of God," said Tate Whitlow very quietly. The extraction took an hour and 40 minutes. The exterior cabin was, as Jonah had predicted to the dispatcher, a total loss. The cabin walls had taken the secondary slurry wave at 21 feet of crest and had held only the lower three courses. The chestnut log walls above the third course had sheared off and floated down holler. The roof had gone with them. The chimney mass, against which the slurry had broken laterally, had held its bottom 9 feet and had lost its upper 29. What remained on the cabin's footprint, when Jonah came up out of the stove on the rebar rungs and emerged through the firebox into the daylight at hour 39 plus 40 minutes, was the foundation, the lower three courses of log, the chimney to a height of 9 feet, the ironwood stove, and the hearth flagstone, still in its seat, still settled into the mortar he had tuned in May 2025. Everything else was gone. The dooryard was gone. The fence was gone. The truck Jonah had left blocking the gate was, as Tate Whitlow informed him, in the lower holler 2 miles downgrade, wedged sideways into a stand of mountain laurel against the wall of an abandoned tipple. The rhododendron at the gate was gone. The gravel cut was gone, replaced by a smooth 30-foot wide channel of drying coal slurry that had begun to crack into hexagonal plates as it dewatered. He came up out of the stove. He helped Royce Hatfield up after him. He helped Maureen Boykin, who had been the slowest of the 8 to recover the use of her knees after 39 hours of sitting. He helped Anita Mullins. He helped Marlene Tilley, who came up carrying Davis on her hip and would not let anyone take him. He helped Coy Tilley, who came up with his prosthetic leg in his hand because the prosthetic had given him grief in the cellar and he had taken it off at hour 20. He helped B. Tilley last among the humans. Hazel came up on her own behind B, because Hazel had decided that B would be the next to last out of the cellar, and Hazel would be last after her. And once Hazel had decided a thing of that nature, she did not require anyone's instruction. What they came up into was the surface of a place that no longer matched their memory of itself. The holler floor was black slurry. The eastern ridge was wooded and untouched. The western ridge, the ridge above which the Big Branch Impoundment had been, was a raw scar of red-orange clay where the dam had taken the entire south face of the ridge with it on the way down. The line of the Coal Run Creek, which had run on the holler floor in a meandering brown channel for as long as anyone in McDowell County could remember, was now a straight black smear that did not bend. Above the line where the slurry had crested, the chestnut oaks were green. Below the line, every tree was either gone or stripped of bark for the lower 15 feet of its trunk. The 7 Coal Run Holler residents stood on the foundation of Jonah Brick's cabin and looked at the place they had lived in their entire lives. Maureen Boykin began to weep without any sound. Royce Hatfield put his arm around her shoulder. Anita Mullins took her other arm. Maureen kept weeping in the slow, open way of a 68-year-old woman who has seen the holler she was born in for the last time in the form she remembered. Marlene Tilley shifted Davis on her hip and pulled B against her side with the other hand. B was still holding Hazel's collar. B was not crying. B had not cried at any point in the 39 hours, and she was not going to start now in front of her mother. Coy Tilley sat down on the hearth flagstone with his prosthetic leg across his lap. He put his head in his hands. He did not, the chief told me later, weep either. He sat with his head in his hands for a long time, looking at the black floor of the holler where the trailer he had raised his children in had been. Jonah Brick stood beside the chimney mast with his hand on the warm stone of it and looked at his cabin's wreckage in the same slow, careful way he had looked at the gate the night Earl Kendrick had walked past for the 3rd time. He did not, in the chief's own telling, feel anything in particular. He was, by his account, mostly tired. There were 3 FEMA helicopters on the holler floor by the time the 8 extracted survivors had been brought down off the cabin foundation to the slurry channel. There were also 2 state police pickup trucks parked sideways at the upper end of the gravel cut, where the gravel cut had become navigable on foot, and there were 9 Charleston-based search and rescue volunteers working their way up the slurry channel with poles probing the black surface for soft places. The dispatcher, Patricia Hensley, met the survivors at the edge of the slurry channel with a clipboard and a folding camp chair for Maureen Boykin to sit in. She was a small woman in her late 40s with gray-streaked dark hair and rectangular glasses, and she had been on the radio with Jonah for 39 hours and 17 minutes, and the two of them shook hands without either of them saying anything for a count of 4. Patricia, Chief, I owe you a coffee. You owe me lunch. All right. She took down the names of the 8 in her clipboard. She confirmed medical status. She paged a pediatric paramedic for B and Davis. The pediatric paramedic, an Asheville-based woman who had flown in with the Charleston team, did the assessment of both children in 7 minutes and pronounced both fit for transport. Davis was sleeping against Marlene's shoulder by the time the assessment was done. B was holding Hazel's collar with her left hand and a fresh granola bar in her right and was looking at the helicopter. Faye Kendrick, Patricia told Jonah, had been admitted to Cabell Huntington Hospital and was stable. Faye Kendrick had asked, twice in the first 6 hours, whether the cabin on the bench above her husband's pond had survived. The first time she had been told no. The second time, she had been told that the cabin had not survived, but that Jonah Brick had. Faye Kendrick had asked, the second time, whether Jonah Brick would be willing to speak with her. Jonah said, I will. Patricia wrote that down on her clipboard. Earl Kendrick's body was recovered at 1600 on the 5th of July, 20 hours after Jonah and the 7 Coal Run residents had come up out of the cellar. The body had been found half a mile down the holler from the foreman's house, hung up in the same stand of mountain laurel that had stopped Jonah's truck. The body was identified by the foreman's wife's brother, who had come up from Beckley on the 4. The body was released to the family for burial. Earl Kendrick had been carrying in the inside breast pocket of his blue Pocahontas coveralls a sealed manila envelope. The envelope contained 3 documents. The first was a handwritten letter to Faye, dated the previous Saturday morning, the 2nd of July. The letter was 3 pages long and was, in the chief's later reading of it, Faye Kendrick gave him a photocopy when they spoke at the hospital 11 days after the event, a complete confession. Earl had known about the South Face since April. He had measured the slip personally. He had filed the standard MSHA monthly with no mention of the slip in May, in June, and in the July filing he had been preparing on Saturday morning. He had told no one at the company. He had told no one at MSHA. He had told Coy Tilley on Wednesday night, drunk in the cab of Coy's S10, that he had been making mistakes and was sorry for them. But he had not told Coy what mistakes specifically. He had told no one else. He had written the letter on Saturday morning. He had sealed it in the manila envelope. He had carried the envelope in his breast pocket on Sunday, the 3rd of July, when he had gone up to the impoundment for what he had told Faye was a routine afternoon inspection of the south face. He had been on the south face of the dam, by the chief's later reconstruction with the FEMA engineering team, at the moment the first slip propagated upward. He had not had time to come down. The second document in the envelope was a will. Earl Kendrick had left everything he owned, including the deed to the small house up the holler from Jonah's cabin and the proceeds of his life insurance policy and the contents of his retirement account, to his wife, Faye, to be used at her discretion for her medical care. The third document was a single sheet of lined paper, torn from a school notebook. On the sheet, in Earl Kendrick's left-hand printing, were 3 lines. The first line read, 27th of May, 11:18 a.m., south face, 1.25 inches. The second line read, June 19th, 2:42 p.m., south face, 1 3/8 inches. The third line read, July 2nd, 7:09 a.m., south face, 1.5 inches. Below those 3 lines, in slightly different ink, Earl had written a 4th line. The 4th line read, God forgive me. Faye, I tried. Faye Kendrick gave the chief a photocopy of all 3 documents on the 17th of July, 2026, in a private room at Cabell Huntington Hospital. She was 46 years old. She was bald from her chemotherapy. She told the chief, in remission status for the previous 6 months, but had been kept on maintenance therapy. She asked the chief to sit down. She had a small folder on her lap. She did not, the chief told me, look like a woman whose husband had killed himself in front of 3 holler families by withholding information. You know what Earl did, she said. I do. You know what I knew about what Earl did. I know what Earl wrote in the letter. He said you didn't know. He said he was the only one. She nodded. Her hands moved on the folder. I knew he was scared in April. I didn't ask what about. I thought it was about the cancer. I thought he was scared about whether he was going to be able to keep my treatment going if anything happened to his job. All right. I didn't ask in May. I didn't ask in June. I didn't ask on the 28th of June when he told me at dinner that he had been walking past your gate. The chief did not, in his telling to me, react to this. He sat in the chair beside the hospital bed and he waited. I knew he was going up the ridge on the 2nd, she said. On the Saturday. He told me at lunch he was going up to check the south face. He had been going up almost every weekend since April. I didn't ask. Faye, I want to tell you what I want to tell you, please. He nodded. I want to tell you that I knew, on the 2nd, that something was wrong, and I did not ask. I did not ask because I was afraid that whatever the answer was, the answer would mean I would have to do something about it. And I was very tired, and I am still very tired. And on the 3rd, when the sound came down the holler, I was lying in our bedroom, and I had been reading, and when the sound came, I knew. I knew before the wall got to the house. I knew what Earl had done, and what I had not done. She paused. 3 families are dead, Mr. Brick. There were 6 houses below us. 3 families got out. 3 families did not. The cars were at church. The Sizemore boys were on a fishing trip in Tennessee. The Boykins, the Hatfields, the Tillies, they got out because of you, because of your truck, because of your cellar. She turned the folder around on her lap and slid it across the bedclothes toward him. This is everything that was in Earl's pocket. I am not going to give the original to the company. I am not going to give it to MSHA. I am going to give it to you, and I am going to ask you to do with it what you think Earl would have wanted you to do. Given that he died on the south face with it in his pocket, in the act of trying, too late, but trying, to tell. The chief did not move for a count of 4. Then he opened the folder. He read the 3 documents. He closed the folder. What do you think Earl would have wanted me to do, Faye? I think Earl would have wanted you to use it to make sure the south face of the next pond was measured by somebody who would tell. I think Earl would have wanted you to use it to make sure the next foreman did not have a wife with cancer and an insurance policy he could only keep by lying. I think Earl would have wanted you to use it to make sure that the people of Coal Run Holler, what's left of them, are taken care of. The chief sat with the folder closed on his knees. I will do what I can with this, he said. Thank you. He stood up. He shook her hand. He said, I'm sorry about Earl, Faye. She said, I am sorry too. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already. I read the comments on these accounts more closely than you might think. And if you leave a note on this one telling me where you are watching from and what the temperature is outside your window tonight, I will try to read every one of them. We tell these stories because the people in them deserve to be remembered. And because somewhere even now, somebody is reading them and thinking about the kind of cellar they would want under their own house if the pond above them ever decided not to hold. The chief sold what was left of the cabin foundation, the chimney mass, and the parcel itself to the McDowell County Historic Preservation Society in October of 2026. The society paid him $9,000, which was the assessed value of the foundation and the chimney as a National Register candidate. The society plans, when funding is in place, to restore the cabin atop the original foundation and to interpret the cellar to visitors as a working example of late Victorian Appalachian homesteader masonry and 21st century engineering coexisting on a single hearth. The cellar will not be a hide any longer. It will be a museum. The chief is fine with this. He moved off the parcel on the 22nd of October, 2026. He moved into a small rental house in Welch, on the same block as Wendell Pruitt, the retired UMW miner from the hardware. Hazel moved with him. The 14 books moved with him. The medical case from Shelf 3 moved with him. The 18 carboys did not. The Tillies moved into a FEMA-supplied modular at a temporary settlement above the Tug Fork at the foot of the holler. Coy is, as of the chief's last report to me in late October, 98 days clean. Marlene is still at the Walmart Distribution Center in Bluefield. Davis is in Head Start. B is in the 2nd grade at Welch Elementary. B walks past the chief's rental house twice a school day on her way to the elementary school bus and back. She does not, on either pass, stop or wave or call out. She glances up at the porch. If the chief is on the porch, and on most days he is, she nods, with the same dignity she had brought to the gate on the 29th of June, and she keeps walking. Hazel sits on the porch beside the chief and watches her. The dog has not, in the 11 weeks since the extraction, asked to go to the girl. The dog made her position clear once in the cellar in front of 7 witnesses, and the dog does not feel the need to make it again. The chief told me, on my October visit, that he thinks Hazel is waiting for B to decide. He thinks Hazel understood, in the dark of the cellar in the first hour after the impact, that B was a child whose home life would require the dog at some point in the next several years, and that the dog had filed this away and was waiting. He thinks Hazel is patient enough to wait, possibly, the rest of her life. He does not say any of this to B. He does not say any of this to Marlene. He sits on the porch in the late October light with Hazel across his right boot and Wendell Pruitt's old porch swing creaking faintly 2 houses down, and he watches the school bus come up the road, and B. Tilly gets off the bus, and B. Tilly walks past the porch on her way home, and B. Tilly nods up at him, and B. Tilly walks on. There is one more thing I want to tell you, and then I'm going to let you go. On my October visit, the chief and I walked up the holler from Welch to the cabin foundation. The road is still partly slurry and partly cleared. The slurry is drying in hexagonal plates that crunch underfoot like dry leaves. The Coal Run Creek is back in its bed, more or less, although the bed itself has shifted by between 4 and 11 feet across the length of the holler. The mountain laurel is coming back. The chestnut oaks are coming back. The black bears, which had vacated the upper drainage during the slurry event, are back at the salt licks the state put down on the eastern ridge. We walked up to the foundation. We stood on the hearth flagstone, which was still in its seat. We looked down into the cellar through the open hatch the McDowell County Historic Preservation Society had installed for visitors. I asked the chief, standing there on Elias Brick's hearth in the cool, dry October air with Hazel beside us, what he thought he would have done if Coy Tilly had not been the man he turned out to be. What he would have done if Coy had come to the gate on Thursday morning with the hammer and had used the hammer. What he would have done if B. Tilly had not been the daughter of a clean father by the 3rd of July. The chief looked at me. He looked then at Hazel. He said, I have thought about that. I have thought about that a lot. I have come to the conclusion that the question is the wrong question. The cellar was built for the people who would be in it. The people who were in it were the people who came down the holler when the truck came to their gate. Coy Tilly was the man I had at the gate on Sunday. B. Tilly was the child I had at the school bus on Sunday. I cannot, after the fact, sort through which version of Coy Tilly deserved the cellar and which version did not. The cellar holds what it holds. The dog watches who she watches. I built the one, and I trust the other. That is the entire engineering argument. He paused. My wife told me once, before she died, that the only honest design is the one that works for the worst-case occupant. She had been a Marine Corps intelligence officer, and she had thought about worst cases for 19 years. I took her at her word.